Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
So, a lot to talk about today. The Wall Street kerfuffle, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, I wouldn't panic. We'll dive into why we shouldn't worry too much about that. And I think actually social media may have played a large role in keeping us from driving the economy off a cliff yesterday. I just have a theory about that. But remember as well, I said 2 months ago the Federal Reserve probably should have understood we were already at the soft landing they were looking for. I could go on and on about that, and I will a little bit later. We also have a vice presidential pick to opine about. First things first, though, let's talk with my guest, C-suite tech executive, strategic advisor, executive coach, and award-winning journalist returning to the show, Chitra Raghavan. Good morning, and thank you for joining me. I appreciate that.
Good morning, Ron, and good morning to your great audience. It's always good to be on your show.
So the last time we had you on, we were sort of, I don't want to say nitpicking a bit, but I do want to say we were really diving in on the Fani Willis story in the throes of her taking on arguably the largest case of, well, not just her career, but any prosecutor's career, taking on a former president who most of us believe, tried to overtake an election process subversively. And the reason I wanted to come back to you is, not unlike Fani Willis, presidential candidate and VP Kamala Harris is under some not dissimilar scrutiny simply because she's a woman. And you have written several pieces in recent weeks about Kamala, and I wanted to dive into some of that conversation. You have enlightened me and several of those who have read your pieces about what is called the warmth-competence complex, or matrix, right? Is that what am I saying it right?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah. Now, this seems like a balance that we don't expect to run men through the same filter of, but women are naturally who seek to aspire to some level of leadership have to find this balance. So we already have a little bit of a what one researcher called ambivalent sexism built in to what a candidate like Kamala Harris has to overcome. If you would enlighten me a little bit more on that.
Yes, so you summed it up really well, Ron. The warmth competence matrix isn't talked about a lot, but it's been studied quite extensively by psychologists like Susan Fiske and Mina Chikara and others. And it's this hidden force that shapes women's lives and careers. The warmth competence matrix highlights how women in leadership are judged on two critical dimensions. One is warmth and the other is competence. So just to sum it up, women are typically expected to be warm and approachable, but they're punished if they seem like they're too competent or assertive. And that's what is called ambivalent sexism. It's also called the likability trap. In one of the studies that I mentioned on the show last time, researchers at the University of Michigan and Carnegie Mellon University found that women actually lose status when they network. They're seen as overly dominant and ambitious. And behavioral scientists describe this as a quote unquote zero-sum game for women. In other words, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Now, men like you, Ron, only need one of those traits to be perceived as also having the other. So if they're perceived as being warm, they're also perceived as being competent, but the inverse is true for women. So what does it do for women? It creates this incredibly unique challenge, especially in politics, as they try to balance these perceptions. And as you know, Hillary Clinton is a great example of that. Back in 2016, when she was described as an ice sculpture, cold, competent. And now you're seeing the portrayal of Kamala Harris by Trump and many Republicans in Congress as incompetent, quote unquote, low IQ, et cetera. And we can talk more about how this is specifically affecting her in her role and in her candidacy.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Hillary Clinton, because that was the perception. Very, in fact, maybe even overly competent and not at all warm. I think back to two-time gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, who was also deemed as being very competent, very well-versed in all of the topics of discussion, the subjects that she ran for office on. But you would also hear stories about, Stacey doesn't like to be hugged. And so what? A lot of people don't like to be hugged by strangers. I don't think that's really, but that also came up quite a bit, at least at the state level, in discussion about Stacey Abrams. I even think back to the first time I had to work with a compatriot on an equal footing when I worked in radio back in the 1990s. A female co-host was hired right out of college, and Mackenzie and I, we stay in touch still. She and I both work in real estate, and she's extremely competent and very confident. I kind of remember back to the 90s thinking, wow, she's not a very warm person. She's very driven, but not a very warm person. And she's actually quite a warm person. It just didn't hit me like that initially when we started working together. And I can't even begin to imagine that sort of thought process ran through her head as she was introduced to working with me at the same time.
Yes, and it's those examples. Stacey Abrams is a great example, and then your colleague, and your perception of her, which is very, very similar to what other women in the workplace face. And Harris faces a unique challenge because as a Black and South Asian woman, she has this additional layers of scrutiny that she has to navigate. And, she's shown a lot of warmth and relatability, which obviously is crucial for connecting with voters. And she has that in spades. But because of the zero-sum warmth competence formula that she cannot avoid, there is this persistent perception issue where her competence is questioned, even though she's extensively qualified, including her roles as senator, state attorney general, and these perception problems have only been exacerbated by some of these recent political attacks and media scrutiny, but also her own public speaking and communications challenges, which she has to fix pretty urgently, given the short time frame to the elections.
Yeah, I want to put a pin in that because I'd like to talk about that in just a little bit, but I can't help but keep thinking that there's a running joke about how much she loves Venn diagrams, and I keep thinking of a Venn diagram of warmth and competence and seeing her name in the middle of it. But
you really hit the nail on the head, because her team is actually really leaning into all of her warmth rhetoric. For instance, her mother's quote has become one of those signs, that posters that you stick in your front yard, candidate posters. And then she just released a T-shirt with the Venn diagram. And her team needs to back away from all of this warmth stuff because it's going to make her look incompetent. What she needs to do, and they need to do, is have her own the competence piece, the tough prosecutor, the law and order candidate to offset this Trump strongman persona. And then she needs to potentially just let her outsource, delegate all of this warmth competence, touchy-feely stuff to all of these millennials that are doing all of these memes about her. She needs to just hand that off and let her team and her, in her speeches, in her public appearances, in interviews, showcase her competence. And of course, that's where also surrogates come in, like in the case of Fani Willis, her father, who came to testify on her behalf or to speak on her behalf in that hearing, and really kind of compensated for her cold, incompetent perception. And then, of course, the VP candidate is going to be huge in being that crucial surrogate for Harris.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you next. We're with a C-suite tech executive, strategic advisor, executive coach, and award-winning journalist Chitra Raghavan, who's written several pieces about Kamala Harris just in the last few weeks as she's emerged as the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, presumptive. So is there a perfect vice presidential candidate for her amongst those finalists that we see? Or is there someone who gives more of what she may be lacking or needs to exhibit as a partner of the major candidates in your mind?
Yes, well, that pick is going to be crucial because it's going to impact how that entire ticket is perceived. So a presidential candidate, it's going to probably be a white male from everything we have seen, and it probably should be, right, who is seen as highly competent, can help to balance the ticket, elevate the ticket's image, mitigate concerns about her competence. And if this VP pick is male, white male, he does, the warm competence works in his favor. He doesn't have to be warm. He just has to be competent.
Right.
He'll automatically be perceived as warm. So if he is incredibly competent, he can compensate for her lack of perception of her as a competent person, even though that's not true. If we're talking about perceptions here, and that's what is going to a large part, shape the race, given how tight it is and how little time there is to the elections. And so I think that the Democratic Party has such a deep bench of great candidates, and the ones that have been mentioned are all very high on the competence factor. And so she just has to pick the one that appears to be the most competent, whether it's Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, or Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, or I think that Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona is potentially still in the running. And as you can see, they're all incredibly qualified. And there's also a great, by the way, leadership lesson here for all aging leaders, which is you have to step out of the way to allow this new talent to emerge, which President Biden did after some nudging. And you can see this great crop of new talent that's sprouting up, ready to help Harris lead the nation. So what she needs to do is pick the one that's the most competent. And then she needs to make sure that given the short vetting period, that there isn't like a J.D. Vance type of situation where, their words or their actions will come back to haunt her, this close to the election.
I can't help but notice, too, that there seemed to be a perception anyway that the Democratic Party didn't have a deep bench until President Joe Biden suddenly stepped aside. It was almost like a chorus line, effect on Broadway, where you only see the one dancer. But then when the one steps out of the way, look, there's a whole line of people right behind them. Do you feel as if you came away that I feel the same way? Like 3 months ago, I would not have been able to confidently say we had a deep bench. And now I know that we do.
That chorus line analogy is perfect because it really was the big reveal, right? As soon as Biden stepped out of the way, we're like, oh, wait a minute. We have all these other people, and those are just some of them, right? You look at Pete Buttigieg, and you look at Wes Moore, and you look at, all of these people.
Andy Beshear.
Andy Beshear, any of these candidates could be awesome. And it's going to be a great future for the Democratic Party if the party can continue to nurture these leaders and allow them, as you so well put it, take the front of the stage rather than just be, a backstage dancer.
My guest this morning is Chitra Raghavan. She is a C-suite tech executive, strategic advisor, executive coach, and award-winning journalist. Her column appearing routinely in Psychology Today. We're talking about Kamala Harris and the tightrope she has to walk on the warmth-competence matrix and the ambivalent sexism that put her on that tightrope. We'll dive into more of this discussion, and Chitra offers some advice on her speech writing when we return on The Ron Show, the American One Radio app, AmericanOneRadio.com, or wherever you podcast. You can follow The Ron Show on your preferred social media platforms, or all of them if you'd like. That would be at Ron Show ATL on Facebook, the Twitter X platform, Instagram, and Threads. We are with C-suite executive, coach, advisor, award-winning journalist Chitra Raghavan. Chitra has been writing quite a bit. In fact, we had her on the show, what was it, about 6 months ago or so? It seems like forever, honestly, since we were poring over the Fonnie Willis case here in Fulton County. And now we have another powerful woman who has been thrust into the spotlight, and I think she wanted it in this case, and that would be Vice President Kamala Harris, who is soon, in fact, today we understand, to name her vice presidential nominee. I said 2 weeks ago, I think Tim Walz is the guy, and I think the closer we get to this, the more I feel confident about that, but I could be completely wrong. Anyway, Chitra, thanks for joining us. I want to ask you, you were saying in the first segment that men are almost always assumed to be warm. Harris' opponent, to me, is neither. So is he the outlier? And you were saying that men almost always seem to get the warmth part on cue for fogging a mirror.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your perception and, where you are on the political spectrum as well. I think there are many that would consider former President Donald Trump to be warm or competent. He's got a lot of energy. He's got a lot of passion. And, he's able to really drive into arguments in a very strong way that could convey competence, even if it is not competence. And so I think it would be very, it's hard to judge, because of where you might be in terms of how you see him. But, there are, half the country, right, thinks that he does have some of these traits, or perhaps both these traits, because of that warmth competence formula that really helps men.
But he doesn't have warmth. I mean, no one could argue that he has warmth.
But remember, when you're a guy and you have warmth, you're perceived as being competent.
Okay, but again, that's my point. I don't know that anyone, even some of his biggest fans, could say he has warmth. Competence, there's a debate, but warmth. You were saying that men almost always get the nod for warmth, and I don't.
No, what I'm saying is, if they have one, they are seen as having
the other. Okay, fair enough. So one of the knocks on Kamala Harris that the Trump-Vance campaign has tried to use to their advantage or her disadvantage is her laugh.
Yes, and that goes to the heart of this warmth competence problem, right? She's got a very open, warm, loud laugh, and she has said, this is who I am, this is how I laugh, I'm never going to change who I am. And her advice to young people is, don't try to pretend to be something that you're not. Just be who you are, which actually is very good advice. But in her case, because that showcases her warmth, it's going to have an inverse relationship on whether she comes as competent. And because a lot of the attacks have been so personalized against her on the basis of race and, her mannerisms and all of this stuff, she needs to just move away from, she's kind of her own worst enemy at this point. She needs to move away from some of these kind of cliched speech tricks and focus on genuine substantive communication because, today, you're dealing with the age of social media where authenticity is key, right? People are looking for real connections. They don't want these rehearsed sound bites. She probably needs maybe a different speechwriter. We don't know where the stuff is coming from. Interestingly, I'm working on a piece on some of these issues that she's dealing with. And I watched Abby Phillips' documentary about her on CNN, and it's really worth watching. It was on last weekend again on Anderson Cooper's show. And it really delves deep into her background, her career as prosecutor, as state attorney general. It's a very different Kamala Harris that you see. She's very focused. She's very direct. She is very substantive. And the question is, so what happened, right? Who is this person who's delivering these word salads left and right that's becoming the focus of her opponents' attacks on her? And she has had so many of these, right? You've seen them being put together in these videos and stuff, but also on the positive side, they're being turned into fun memes by her supporters as well. We have to say that, but it's actually detracting from her. So what happened in the process of her going from a state attorney general and a senator to becoming a vice president and then a presidential candidate? Something's gone on. She's either gotten overtrained, has bad speech writing, she's had poor media training. She just needs to be very direct with the American people. And of course, the world is watching as well. She needs to emphasize what her leadership skills are, her policy expertise. She needs to avoid these cliched phrases and, just get down to the nitty gritty, right? Because, for instance, yesterday, she was in the Situation Room with President Biden, and they're trying to diffuse this escalating crisis in the Mideast with this potential impending strike by Iran against Israel for the assassination of the Hamas leader who was visiting Tehran. And by the way, the Iranian retaliation could happen even as she names her running mate. So she is, her team could be emphasizing her role in these discussions, showing her foreign policy chops, things like that. And just to give you another example, when former President Barack Obama and Michelle Obama had this very cute video with Vice President Harris, endorsing her and supporting her. That was like a huge wasted opportunity, right? That video was kind of hokey, and all it did was emphasize warmth. I think that there was the New York Times that said it was kind of like two parents sending their beloved daughter to college, and it was, and Michelle Obama was talking about how she loves her laugh and her warmth. They need to come out straight and say, she is highly qualified to be president, and here is why. So everyone needs to get on the same page on this and start to really, start talking about why she deserves and has earned the right to be the nation's commander in chief, right? What do people want to know? They want to know whether she's capable of making these very, very hard decisions. Is she able to take on this somber responsibility of sending our troops abroad? And if so, why do they need to go abroad, especially given that Trump has the opposite idea of much more a nationalistic view of what the United States role is in the world. And she needs to explain to people how she's going to bring those troops back home safe. She needs to show them, is she capable of dealing with the thugs and the strongmen of this world like Putin? That's what people need to know. And given how close this race is, that's what is going to make them decide ultimately whether they trust her or not. And her surrogates need to do this for her.
My guest is Chitra Raghavan. She's an award-winning journalist, executive coach, and C-suite tech executive and strategic advisor. More on what Kamala Harris is doing wrong and right when we return.
This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Rejoining me for a few more minutes here, C-suite tech executive, strategic advisor, executive coach, and award-winning journalist Chitra Raghavan. We were talking about Kamala Harris. She, at any point in time, even somewhere in the middle of this show airing on America One Radio in the 9 to 10 o'clock hour, she may reveal who her vice presidential candidate will be. And by the way, we're getting all sorts of indications that it's going to be Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. We're told that Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro has been told he will not be the choice in the Kamala Harris presidential campaign to join her alongside on the ticket. So deduction would tell us Tim Walz, and I'm sitting here monitoring CNN and MSN and Fox, and they're all looking at Tim Walz. So anyway, we'll get to that in just a few more minutes. While I still have Chitra on the phone, however, let's keep honing in on our conversation with Chitra. I have to say, like where we left off the conversation before the break, Chitra, you were really going in on Kamala Harris and some of her speech writing needing tweaking. I can't help but think the same thing, honestly, as I was watching her in Atlanta last week. I was listening to the same speech. I've seen her give that speech before, and in such a short window of time, I feel like her candidacy has a unique opportunity to not go out and do the same stump speech every time, and probably shouldn't. In social media and with YouTube and with so much cable television scrutiny, and this shows like this that will re-air large chunks of her stump speech, to me it's important to get off the plane in a different city, do a different stump speech. Would you agree with that? And again, in such a short window, you were talking about her showing off her competence more and the warmth less to be able to affect that. I feel like maybe it's time to have a team of speechwriters to keep just slaving away at different speeches, no matter where she's going.
It's not how many different speeches she gives; it's giving that right speech. She can, most candidates end up doing stump speeches, but it has to hit those key notes. And that's the question of whether she is doing that, and she has to do it consistently. Consistency is the key here because there's very little time to waste, and there has to be a finely honed message. And she and her surrogates, whether they are her, political, Democratic political pundits, or whether they are people on her team, her speechwriters, and she herself has to be very, very honed in on making 2 or 3 key points. And that is that she, has earned the right. She's immensely qualified to be president. She has deep subject matter expertise, and she has the ability. She's had the experience of being by Biden's side over the past few years, helping make critical decisions on national security, domestic security, that she can keep the economy on the right track, that it's not going to get derailed, that she can, push back on people like Vladimir Putin. Those are kind of that she knows how to deal with China. And all of these situations, she has it. Why isn't it coming across? That's the question they need to ask themselves. And they need to look at this warmth competence thing and really lean heavily into competence.
Which takes me back to the ambivalent sexism that I think you mentioned that one researcher had noted. Because again, when folks think about the Vladimir Putins or the President X's of the world, the Kim Jong Uns, the Viktor Orbans, there are a lot of nefarious individuals out there along the planet. Iran, Hamas, that even Benjamin Netanyahu, an ally who doesn't really seem like much of an ally to the Biden-Harris administration right now, she's going to have to show that she can go toe-to-toe with them. And I almost feel like the headlines are giving her so many opportunities to flex her muscle and show that she is not just capable of doing the job, but she's actually been right there doing it already.
No, that's a very good point, right? Every day there's a headline that is an opportunity for her to showcase her competence. I think that's a really important point that you're making. And so, Trump uses it in a very interesting way to say, hey, make me president because the thugs know that I am tough and they will not mess with me. However, his claim is because she is quote unquote incompetent in his view, the thugs will take advantage of her when she becomes president. And, it's a very insidious and misogynistic argument, but people are listening, right? And so she has to counter things like that.
Yeah, and it's not as if we don't have 4 years of record of Trump in office actually being taken advantage of by thugs like Z and Putin, but that's another matter for another day. That's not what you came here to discuss. You came here to discuss the warmth-competence matrix and how delicate a tightrope it is, and I'm sure you've had to experience that yourself in your career.
I've been thinking about that a lot because I only came to learn of this when I became a regular columnist this year for Psychology Today. I have a column in Psychology Today, and I started looking at these things, and I started thinking about my own career. And I have to say, I have had a very blessed career. I've worked incredibly hard, but my entire career has been built on with the help of really powerful mentors who really somehow found me and took me from role to role to role and gave me enormous opportunities. And so I look back and I go, wow, I have been so blessed and lucky to literally build a career through mentors rather than, hawking my resume and things like that. But then I've asked myself, if I knew more about this warmth competence thing when I was younger, would I have done things differently? Would it have helped me understand decisions my bosses may have made or not made? And then I started to think, I think that one place where this could really be playing a role is and is playing a role is in board seats for women. As you know, there's such a dearth of board representation for women. And in fact, even when there are women, I saw this fascinating piece in the New York Times a few years ago about how a few select group of women are picked over and over again. They're approached over and over again by companies to serve on boards. And these women are exhausted. They are on too many boards and they're saying, hey, we can't be on your board. Go find other qualified women. But they keep coming back to the small crop, even though there is a universe of talented, smart, educated, qualified women who can have these board roles. And I often wonder if, how much of a role warmth competence plays at the very highest levels of board positions in corporate America, just as it is now playing in the highest role of the land, the president of the United States and the commander in chief.
And I don't know why, but I just flashed to mentally the image of the three women, the three black women on the podium for the floor exercise yesterday at the Paris Olympics, and how the two American women decided to bow to the Brazilian that won the overall. When you mentioned women sitting on these boards and going, listen, I'm on too many of these. I need, go find another competent woman. I don't know why, but that image just popped into my head. Is there something to that?
Yeah, I think definitely, being generous enough when you're at the highest levels in government or corporate America or in education or healthcare to say, look, I have a wealth of, roles and positions. I can afford to be generous and share the wealth with other women because, there's such an amazing universe of people out there that are talented and just waiting for the opportunity to showcase their abilities, just like these vice presidential candidates were just waiting behind Biden, or Harris was waiting behind Biden, and then all of these other leaders popped up. So your Broadway analogy, going back to that. So I definitely think there's a huge opportunity here for people, men and women. And in fact, in my coaching, I know that I'll be placing a much greater emphasis, even with my male clients, to talk about warmth competence, because how are they nurturing the talent of their female employees,
Yes.
just like I was nurtured, right? I was nurtured repeatedly by people of, Black women, white men, white women. I had a huge array of mentors just giving me opportunities. So the question is, what are men doing today, and women, to nurture the next crop of leaders?
My last question to you will be this, and by the way, we're with Chitra Raghavan. She's a C-suite tech executive, strategic advisor, executive coach, award-winning journalist, and you heard her mention that she has a recurring column in Psychology Today. There's been a lot of talk about Kamala Harris being a DEI hire, and I noticed that the Trump-Vance campaign and conservative punditry have sort of shelved that quip. Can you explain why that might be? I have a theory, but I wanted to hear what your initial thoughts on that were.
Well, I think one answer to that is that there has been quite a bit of pushback even in the Republican Party. And as you know, the Republican Party is not monolithic, just like the Democratic Party. And there are a lot of Republicans who are very, very concerned. Even pro-Trump / MAGA Republicans and leaders in Congress are very concerned about this emphasis on attacking her as a DEI candidate, going after her on the basis of race and gender. And, even Lindsey Graham, for instance, has pushed back on that idea, and others as well have advised and urged her. His advisors are really very, very concerned. They're hoping that, here's the thing, they're hoping that Trump will attack her for her quote unquote lack of competence, but he's doing it by attacking her as, her warmth, and saying she's DEI, she's, she doesn't know whether she's Black or she's Indian, her laugh, lunatic Kamala, crazy Kamala, all the stuff. And his own party is very concerned that this is going to have a huge backlash. And you saw that at the NABJ conference, where, he just really went on the offensive, and then he's doubling down on it. So I think there's a lot of concern about this strategy.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that sometimes you just step back and let Donald be Donald, because they don't seem to have a handle on him. At the end of the day, they can prepare all the nice speeches they want, but when he goes off teleprompter, and he always goes off teleprompter, he's going to revert back to the basal stuff that always rears its head when he's given an opportunity to speak.
Yeah, I think that his campaign has as much work to do as Kamala Harris's campaign, but in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Chitra Raghavan, thank you so much for joining the Ron Show and exploring the depths of the warmth competence matrix.
Always a pleasure, Ron. Thank you so much.
All right. Tim Walz is joining the campaign as Kamala Harris's vice presidential candidate. We will weigh in on that decision when the Ron Show returns on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, ProgressiveVoices.com, or if you podcast, wherever you podcast.
Good morning. Wonderful to be with you all. Tim Walz is wonderful, and she had many good choices among the 6 and certainly among the 2. I'm a big fan of Governor Shapiro. Tim Walz, I know very well. He served in the House. To characterize him as left is so unreal. It's just not what the question. He's right down the middle. He's a Heartland of America Democrat. And he was the chair of our Veterans Affairs Committee. And I don't want anybody to forget that, because he made tremendous, tremendous gains for our veterans, working with our folks on the Appropriations Committee and with the Speaker. We made more progress than had ever been made in the history of our country since the GI Bill under his leadership. 25 years in the National Guard, longest serving non-commissioned officer ever served in the Congress of the United States. So he brings the security credential, he brings the rural credential, and he will do well in Moral America. And I heard Joe say, well, Biden did better. Well, Biden was running against Donald Trump. Joe Biden, Tim Walz was running against somebody who had more credentials in rural America, but he still won. He still won. So I really, it's mystifying to me to see someone that I worked with, shall we say, right down the middle, characterized on the left in this regard.
That is Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, on Morning Joe just a few minutes ago. Actually, probably more like an hour ago. You have to remember, I pre-record this show in the 8 to 9 o'clock hour. We haven't yet, at least as I'm putting this show together, gotten the sizzle reel, the official announcement. But by all indications, and if Nancy Pelosi is on Morning Joe talking about Tim Walz as Kamala Harris's VP pick, then he is obviously Kamala Harris's VP pick. Some thoughts on that? Well, I said last week, I believe he's the guy. Let's go back and I'll give you some of that audio. This is me, literally, Monday, July 29th. I think it's Tim Walz. Yeah, the Minnesota governor. This guy's playing. I could get. Listen, my dad doesn't vote, and he probably watches more Fox News than he ought to. My dad, comes away with some of the same opinions that someone who just kind of casually follows American politics. I could get my dad to vote for Tim Walz. You know why? Listen to this.
But today I have probably a more important job. My job today is to be dad to a 17-year-old daughter named Hope, who's here. And Hope and Hope woke up like many of you did 5 weeks ago and said, Dad, you're the only person I know who's in elected office. You need to stop what's happening with this. I'll take my kick in the butt for the NRA. I spent 25 years in the Army and I hunt. And I gave the money back, and I'll tell you what I have been doing. I've been voting for common sense legislation that protects the Second Amendment, but we can do background checks. We can do CDC research. We can make sure we don't have reciprocal carry among states, and we can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at. We won't do it by dividing us. We will doing it by bringing in responsible gun owners from the side to make this happen. Give me the opportunity to earn your endorsement. We will make these things happen in Minnesota and make sure that this state continues its long progressive tradition. Thanks for having me.
By the way, that was not him running, for vice president or seeking a nomination for vice president. That was him when he was running for governor. Dude's a former football coach. He knows how to give the locker room speech. In fact, speaking of football coach, this was from his campaign, a campaign ad that they ran when he was running for governor.
It's halftime in Minnesota. Time to regroup, refocus, and choose a plan that tackles today's toughest challenges. Some leaders retreat. They say our only choice is to cut back. They point fingers, offer shortcuts, they try to divide. But Minnesotans know better. The women and men who came before us carved out a life in the unforgiving North. They survived by investing in the future, teaching their children to build communities that last. Immigrant farmers, lumberjacks and miners, champions of freedom and refugees, and people who've been here all along, the Anishinaabe and the Dakota. Our blood saved the Union at Gettysburg. Our iron forged the tanks that liberated Europe. Our farmers sparked a green revolution that fed the world. Our imagination transformed medicine. What many describe as the Minnesota miracle, that's just what we do here. We've proven that when we come together as one Minnesota, we can do anything. I've seen it. I've led soldiers. I've taught students. I've coached state champions. We'll win by doubling down on the next Minnesota miracle, inspiring our kids to dream, setting lofty goals, and lifting each other up to accomplish them. Because if Washington won't lead, Minnesota will. In this state, we don't fear the future. We create the future. And when we stand together, we win. It's halftime, Minnesota. And what happens next is up to you.
Who wouldn't run through walls for that guy? I want to put my football helmet on and shoulder pads and go out there and win the second half. And this guy speaks clearly about equality in ways that we've seen so much pushback against diversity, equity, and inclusion from the right. Corporations are waffling on this now. He speaks from a football coach, plain-spoken point of view, not drunk uncle at Thanksgiving point of view, but just from a point of view that I think resonates with the average American voter. Listen to this.
Why is it so hard to understand when somebody else gets them right, it's not like a damn pie. Oh, somebody got a bigger piece of pie. I don't get it. Rights aren't that way. There's enough for everybody. There's enough for everybody to be included. Same thing with jobs. Same thing with housing. Same thing with health care. So, you saw it. We are not going to allow them to make the case. Yes, they're a threat, but we're not going to stay in their frame. We're not going to stay where they're at. We're not going to play their game. We called them out for the weird nonsense that they believe, and we presented a different argument to the American public, one where everybody matters, one where we can achieve, one where we solve problems. And what's so great about this is we know here in Minnesota that message works. We are the majority. That's why they shrink the vote. That's why they make it harder to vote. That's why they try and bring fear. And that's why they try and get you to the point where you're pessimistic. And what difference does it make?
If the Harris campaign announced that Tim Walz is their choice for vice president, I'm fully behind this. I'm very excited about this. Jake Tapper has some concerns, however, but even then, Tim Walz responds, chef's kiss.
But you've legalized recreational marijuana, you passed universal background checks on guns, you expanded LGBTQ protections, you implemented tuition-free college for low-income Minnesotans. There's free breakfast and lunch for school kids. Do you think your record is an asset to the ticket, or would it risk fueling Trump's attacks as you being a big government liberal?
What a monster. Kids are eating and having full bellies so they can go learn. And women are making their own health care decisions. And we're a top 5 business state. And we also rank in the top 3 of happiness. Look, they're going to label whatever they're going to label. He's going to roll it out, mispronounce names, to try and make the case. The fact of the matter is, where you see the policies that Vice President Harris was a part of making, Democratic governors across the country executed those policies, and quality of life is higher, the economies are better, all of those things. Educational attainment is better. So, yeah, my kids are going to eat here, and you're going to have a chance to go to college, and you're going to have an opportunity to live where we're working on reducing carbon emissions. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have personal incomes that are higher, and you're going to have health insurance. So if that's where they want to label me, I'm more than happy to take the label.
Oh, God. They should just be followed up with them. Tim Walz and I approve this message. That was me reviewing why I believe Tim Walz, who was a dark horse, who came out of nowhere to become Kamala Harris's vice presidential selection, was the right selection to make. I believe that was 8 days ago I made this. Yeah, 8 days ago. I said this on this very show. I'm not I'm not a soothsayer. I'm not a preeminent or anything like I don't come from the I just believe that was the guy. And damned if I wasn't right. I like when I'm right. I also want to tell you that the stock market stuff yesterday is probably a precursor for some up and down for the coming 3 months or so. There's a tightened presidential race, and folks on Wall Street and throughout the world in the economic market are anxious, hand-wringing they are. Even watching the Federal Reserve, who was it me again? This is me being the prognosticator about a month or two ago when I said maybe the Federal Reserve needs to see where we are then as the soft landing they've been looking for a couple of years. I said then maybe they should go ahead and start lowering rates now, and they didn't want to. And I had a lot of pushback from people who are smarter than I am about this stuff. Honestly, we're like, no, it's too early. And yet I kind of feel like maybe it's not, and I kind of get the idea that July's unemployment numbers, which weren't terrible. They weren't terrible at all. They just didn't meet whatever the expectation was. And then the jitteriness in the market, I think that's a little bit of an answer to the fact that, okay, the American economy looks like it's about to stall out. Time for the Federal Reserve to act as they say they wanted to at the right time. I said, 4, 6, 8 weeks ago, Federal Reserve might ought to go ahead and act now to prevent a harder soft landing than the one that they got. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Tim Walz it is, and that's what the headline of the day is. And I want to thank Chitra Raghavan for joining us to talk about the warmth-competence matrix and how Vice President and Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris has to walk that tightrope. Please listen to that in its entirety via podcast at ronshowatl.com or review podcast. Back tomorrow. Have a great one, y'all.